The study of selling and advertising has long been entangled with the practice of commerce, but it was not until the growth of psychological science in the late 19th century that men began to inquire systematically into the reasons why customers buy. Merchants of earlier centuries knew how to barter, how to display their wares, and how to entice with color or form. Yet their methods rested upon tradition and intuition, rather than upon careful study of the mental processes involved. It was only when psychology, once confined to the speculations of philosophers, turned toward experiment and observation, that its fruits could be gathered for the service of trade. The emergence of experimental psychology in Germany, with Wundt and his pupils, and later the spread of laboratories across Europe and America, brought forth a new confidence that the operations of the mind might be examined with the same rigor as physical objects. The psychologist with his chronoscope and tachistoscope measured the smallest intervals of attention, the briefest span of perception, and these measures began to suggest lessons for the seller and advertiser. In this historical development, we perceive that commerce awaited the scientific awakening. Men had long suspected that suggestion, repetition, and habit played their part in persuasion, but they lacked a language and a method to describe these processes. The ancient rhetoricians spoke of ethos, pathos, and logos, and the merchant relied upon eloquence, fair dealing, and display. Yet not until psychology had revealed the association of ideas, the laws of habit, and the conditions of memory, could these observations be knit into a body of knowledge. The application of psychology to advertising thus represents not a novelty of invention, but rather the systematic refinement of practices already in use. The importance of human behavior in selling rests upon the simple fact that buying is an act of the mind before it is an act of the hand. The coin is transferred only when the will of the buyer is moved. The product may possess utility, but utility alone is insufficient. One man may pass by a necessary article because his attention is elsewhere, while another may purchase an object of little use because his desire is stirred. Hence the seller who ignores psychology neglects the very forces upon which his livelihood depends. To know human nature, to discern the motives that lie beneath words and gestures, to understand the interplay of emotion and reason, is to hold the key to influence. The tradesman of former days might rely upon the scarcity of goods or the immediacy of need, but in an age of abundance and competition, he must rely upon persuasion. The recognition that the mind of the customer is the true battleground is the starting point of a scientific psychology of selling. Why does human behavior matter? Because men are not mere calculating machines who buy always at the lowest price. They are creatures of habit, emotion, and imitation. A woman may purchase a brand of soap not because she has compared its chemical composition, but because she recalls its pleasant fragrance from childhood. A young man may buy a certain hat because he has seen it upon his admired companion. A father may choose a cereal for his children because the image upon the package appeals to his sentiment of care. In each case, the motive is psychological, rooted in memory, association, and emotion rather than in analysis. The recognition of such motives is indispensable if we are to guide the buyer's choice. The early theories of persuasion, though not framed in the language of psychology, already indicated certain truths. The principle of authority, for example, was long recognized by merchants who displayed royal warrants or testimonials of famous men. The principle of scarcity was used when sellers urged haste by warning of limited stock. The principle of social proof appeared in markets where crowds themselves attracted more buyers. These practices anticipated later psychological findings. When experimentalists studied suggestion, they observed that the mind is moved most easily when alternatives are not weighed too carefully, and that repetition of a simple idea gradually wears a pathway into the consciousness. Thus, the merchant who continually presents his brand in newspapers, on billboards, and in shop windows is not merely wasting ink and paint, but rather building an association so strong that the buyer chooses almost automatically. The psychology of habit assures him that once a man has purchased his article several times, resistance diminishes and custom prevails. In the historical background of advertising, one sees a steady transition from crude proclamation to subtle persuasion. The town crier of medieval times announced wares with loud voice, appealing chiefly to attention through sound. The printed handbill of the 17th century offered greater permanence, but often with extravagant claims that bred distrust. By the 19th century, illustrated posters and newspaper advertisements multiplied, but still lacked the refinement of psychological study. It was only with the advent of scientific management and the growth of psychology as a discipline that businessmen sought not merely to shout louder, but to speak more effectively. The work of psychologists, such as M. Hugh Ensterberg and Scott, demonstrated that experiments on memory, attention, and suggestion could yield principles applicable to advertising copy and salesmanship. This movement reflected the wider faith of the age that science could guide industry. Understanding human behavior in sales does not mean to manipulate or to deceive, but rather to harmonize the presentation of goods with the natural workings of the mind. The principle of attention teaches us that the mind cannot grasp many stimuli at once. Therefore, the advertisement must be simple, its message clear and unencumbered. The principle of association reminds us that ideas linked with pleasure or with respected institutions acquire borrowed value. The principle of contrast reveals that differences attract notice more than similarities. By mastering such laws, the seller transforms guesswork into art and art into science. The early theories of persuasion also rested upon the dual nature of man's mental life, divided between reason and emotion. Philosophers long debated whether the will was moved by rational calculation or by the passions. Modern psychology shows that both play their part, but in practice emotion often precedes and directs reason. The buyer who feels an impulse of desire seeks reasons to justify it afterward. The advertiser who stirs imagination or awakens fear provides the impulse. The mind of the customer then supplies the rationalization. Thus, a man may purchase insurance because he fears loss and afterward explain that it is a wise investment. The cause is emotional, the defense rational. This understanding warns us not to rely solely upon logical argument in sales, but to weave together feeling and thought in one persuasive fabric. Consider the role of suggestion in the seller's art. Suggestion works because the human mind is inclined to accept ideas presented with confidence, especially when no contrary idea is present. The physician's prescription, the teacher's command, the leader's example. These are accepted without dispute because they come clothed in authority. In sales, the same principle appears when the clerk places the desired article into the customer's hand, saying this is what you need. The physical contact, the confident tone, the absence of hesitation, all serve to suggest acceptance. Experiments show that the power of suggestion increases when the subject is fatigued, distracted, or lacking knowledge, conditions often present in the bustle of shopping. The wise salesman therefore cultivates confidence, simplicity, and assurance. Habit is another great ally. The buyer, who has once chosen a brand and found it satisfactory, is disposed to choose it again, not through fresh deliberation, but through the inertia of habit. Each repetition strengthens the pathway until it becomes automatic. This explains why large expenditures in advertising to secure trial purchases are justified, for the profit comes not from the first sale, but from the many that follow. The psychology of habit thus undergirds the strategy of modern advertising campaigns. We may also note the role of imitation, for man is a social creature who looks to his fellows for guidance. The crowd at the shop door, the testimonial of a neighbor, the approval of a group, all exert a force upon the hesitant buyer. This principle was recognized by early traders who arranged for confederates to purchase publicly, thereby encouraging others to follow. Modern advertisers use the same principle when they proclaim millions have bought, or when in doubt, choose what the majority prefers. The individual, unwilling to stand alone, is drawn into conformity by the suggestion of numbers. The early theories of persuasion thus converge upon a few central truths: that attention must be gained before desire can be stirred, that emotion often leads while reason follows, that repetition breeds habit, and that social influence is powerful. These truths, scattered among the practices of merchants for centuries, were gathered and clarified by psychology. With the advent of experimental study, they ceased to be mere rules of thumb and became principles supported by evidence. When we reflect upon the historical background, we see that psychology entered commerce not by accident but by necessity. The increasing complexity of markets, the abundance of competing goods, and the sophistication of consumers demanded more than intuition. Just as the engineer turned to physics and the farmer to agricultural science, so the merchant turned to psychology. The result is a body of knowledge that, though still in its youth, has already reshaped the practice of selling and advertising. It teaches that to understand the buyer is more profitable than to praise the product, that to know the springs of human conduct is more fruitful than to multiply mere words, and that the true art of selling is founded upon the laws of the mind. The mind of the buyer is a field of inquiry both intricate and essential, for in it are contained the sources of every commercial exchange. To study the buyer is to study the springs of human action themselves, to penetrate the motives that impel men and women to part with their wealth in order to acquire objects and services. The seller who supposes that purchase is a simple act of calculation mistakes the nature of mankind. He imagines the buyer to be a ledger of prices, balancing costs against benefits. Yet in truth the mind of the buyer is filled with impulses, memories, fears, and aspirations that shape his conduct far more powerfully than arithmetic. To grasp these forces is to come nearer to the mastery of persuasion than can ever be achieved by logic alone. The motivations of buyers are varied and often obscure even to themselves. A man who enters a shop may suppose he seeks only a tool to serve some need, but in fact his choice may be guided by pride, by imitation, or by habit. He may prefer one brand because it recalls his youth, another because it is admired by his companions, another still because the advertisement has lodged in his memory. These motives, though hidden, direct his decision. The study of such motives reveals that they fall into two broad classes, those of necessity and those of desire. Necessities arise from the demands of the body for food, clothing, and shelter, and from the practical needs of work. Desires arise from the imagination, from the wish to appear prosperous, to be admired, to enjoy pleasure or comfort beyond mere survival. Both necessity and desire are genuine, but desire enlarges the field of commerce beyond the narrow boundary of subsistence. The process of decision-making begins with the awakening of need or want, followed by the perception of possible means of satisfaction. The buyer's mind surveys alternatives, whether deliberately or in fleeting impressions, and then inclines toward one. Yet this process is seldom purely rational. Reason may appear at the surface, offering justifications, but beneath reason lie the subtle currents of emotion. Psychology shows us that attention is drawn most easily by objects which arouse feeling, that memory preserves most tenaciously those impressions tinged with emotion, and that the will is strengthened by desire more than by calculation. Thus, the buyer who feels a strong impulse toward an article will afterward invent reasons to defend his choice, while the true source of his action was the initial stir of emotion. This understanding is of highest importance for the seller, who must appeal not only to the intellect, but to the heart. The emotional drivers of purchasing include pride, fear, love, vanity, curiosity, and the longing for comfort. Pride may lead a man to select a costly garment to display his status. Fear may prompt the purchase of insurance or safety devices. Love impels the parent to buy toys or wholesome foods for the child. Vanity guides the choice of cosmetics or ornaments. Curiosity leads the buyer to try a new product. The desire for comfort motivates the choice of furnishings, of convenient appliances, of foods that please the palate. Each of these emotions, when touched, exerts a compelling force, often more potent than reasoned argument. The seller who recognizes these impulses and aligns his presentation with them secures the sympathy of the buyer's will. Rational drivers are not absent, but they function differently. The buyer may calculate price, durability, or efficiency, and these considerations are real. Yet even here psychology reminds us that perception is influenced by desire. A man who covets an article will interpret its price as moderate. One who lacks desire will judge the same price as excessive. Rational comparisons are thus colored by feeling. The wise advertiser therefore supports his appeal to emotion with facts that appear to justify the choice, so that the buyer may feel both the warmth of desire and the security of reason. When emotion and reason are combined, the decision is swift and enduring. The psychology of needs, wants, and desires reveals further complexity. Needs are those impulses rooted in the organism itself, such as hunger, thirst, or protection against cold. Wants are the socially shaped forms which these needs assume, such as the preference for one food over another, one style of clothing over another. Desires are the imaginative enlargements of wants, extending beyond necessity into the realm of aspiration. For example, hunger is a need, the wish for bread is a want, the craving for a particular delicacy is a desire. The seller who discerns this hierarchy perceives that commerce does not cease with the satisfaction of needs but grows continually as wants and desires are cultivated. Advertising often performs this cultivation, teaching men to crave refinements and novelties they had never before considered. Thus the field of selling is bounded not by human necessity, but by the boundless capacity of desire. In studying the buyer's motives, we must also consider the influence of habit. Habit is the crystallization of past choices into present tendencies. Once a buyer has purchased an article repeatedly, the act becomes automatic, freeing him from deliberation. Habit simplifies decision-making and creates stability in markets. Yet habit is not immutable. It can be broken by new stimuli, by stronger desires, by the persuasion of novelty or social approval. Hence the contest among advertisers is often a contest between old habits and new inducements. To dislodge a settled habit requires persistence, for repetition is needed to replace one association with another. This truth explains why advertising campaigns are prolonged, why sellers invest heavily in securing trial purchases, and why brands strive to maintain visibility lest habit decay. Another aspect of buyer psychology is the role of imagination. The buyer does not merely consider the present article, but envisions its future use, the pleasure it may bring, the esteem it may win. Imagination magnifies the appeal of goods beyond their material qualities. A chair is not only wood and fabric, it is the comfort of rest after toil. A suit is not only cloth, it is the dignity of appearance before others. An automobile is not merely a machine, it is the symbol of freedom and progress. The advertiser who can awaken the buyer's imagination multiplies the force of desire. Pictures, stories, and symbols serve this purpose, filling the mind with images that beckon toward possession. The social environment exerts its influence as well. Man is not isolated. He compares himself with his fellows, seeks their approval, fears their disapproval. Much buying is determined by the standards of one's group. Fashion illustrates this vividly. The style that prevails is adopted not because it is inherently superior, but because it is the accepted mark of belonging. The psychology of conformity and imitation ensures that individuals align their purchases with the practices of their circle. Sellers exploit this by showing goods in contexts of social approval, by employing testimonials, by suggesting that the majority have already chosen. In this way, the individual is carried along by the current of society, often without perceiving the force that guides him. Decision-making also involves the interplay of attention and distraction. The buyer in a store or confronted with advertisements is surrounded by a multitude of stimuli. His attention may be fleeting, his mind occupied with other concerns. Hence, the first task of the seller is to arrest attention. Once attention is gained, interest must be sustained long enough for desire to arise. If interest lapses, the opportunity is lost. This sequence, attention, interest, desire, action, though simple, describes the psychological stages of buying. It has been observed in countless transactions and forms a fundamental pattern for salesmanship and advertising alike. The depth of desire often determines the firmness of decision. A weak desire yields easily to competing claims, while a strong desire persists until satisfied. The seller, therefore, aims not merely to awaken desire, but to intensify it. He does this by emphasizing scarcity, by appealing to pride or fear, by showing vivid images of enjoyment, by linking the product with values dear to the heart. The strength of desire, thus cultivated, overcomes hesitation and propels the buyer to act. Once action is taken, the desire is transformed into satisfaction, and satisfaction becomes the seed of future loyalty. Yet we must not suppose that buyers are wholly passive under these influences. They possess intelligence, they reflect, they resist. Psychology does not depict them as puppets, but as complex beings whose conduct arises from the interplay of inner motives and outer suggestions. The task of the seller is not to coerce, but to harmonize, to bring his offering into line with the natural inclinations of the buyer. When the product truly serves a need or fulfills a desire, persuasion succeeds with ease. When the product fails to accord with these motives, persuasion falters. Thus, the study of the buyer is also a study of the product, for only in their meeting does a sale occur. The mind of the buyer, then, is a theater where motives contend, where emotions and reasons play their parts, where habit and imagination guide the course of action. To enter this theater with understanding is the privilege of the scientific seller. He recognizes that beneath the surface of every purchase lies a story of human nature, that each coin spent reflects not only material exchange but the expression of pride, love, fear, or hope. In discerning these truths, he raises selling and advertising from mere trade to a discipline informed by psychology, a discipline that respects the dignity of the buyer while guiding his choice. Attention is the gateway through which every impression must pass before it can influence the mind of the buyer. No matter how fine the product, how persuasive the argument, or how fair the price, if the buyer's attention is not first secured, the message is as though it had never been uttered. The world in which men live is crowded with sights and sounds that compete for the limited focus of the human mind. The eye perceives countless images, the ear receives innumerable sounds, yet consciousness selects only a few at a time. This limitation makes attention the first and greatest obstacle for the advertiser and the salesman. The study of attention in psychology has shown that it is drawn by sudden changes, by striking contrasts, by movement, by novelty, and by anything connected with personal interest. To command attention is therefore not a matter of chance, but of obeying laws as certain as those of physics. In advertising, the problem of capturing attention is constant. The printed page is filled with words, the street with posters, the shop window with displays. Each advertisement seeks to rise above its rivals in order to fix the eye of the passerby. The use of bold type, of color, of striking pictures, of unusual arrangement. All testify to the recognition of this necessity. Yet psychology reminds us that mere loudness or size is not enough. Attention must be not only gained but held, and it must be directed toward the essential feature of the message. A great headline may attract the eye, but if the thought does not arouse interest, the attention will soon wander. The successful advertisement therefore seizes attention by means of novelty or contrast and then immediately connects it with an idea that awakens desire. Curiosity is one of the most powerful allies in this task. The human mind has a natural impulse to seek completion, to resolve uncertainty, to uncover what is hidden. When an advertisement raises a question in the mind of the reader and then offers the product as the answer, it makes use of this impulse. A headline that suggests a mystery, a picture that hints at a story, a phrase that leaves the thought unfinished, all serve to rouse curiosity. But curiosity must not be left unsatisfied, else it produces irritation instead of persuasion. The advertisement must quickly resolve the question, showing how the product fulfills the implied promise. In this way, curiosity becomes a bridge leading from mere attention to active interest. Novelty also plays its part. Men tire of the familiar, the mind craves variation. A new arrangement of words, a fresh style of illustration, an unexpected comparison, all serve to refresh attention. This explains why advertisements must be changed frequently, why even successful campaigns require renewal, why displays in shop windows must be altered. Novelty renews the sense of discovery and prevents wariness. Yet novelty alone is not sufficient, for a novel absurdity may attract attention without securing respect. Novelty must be combined with relevance, with a clear connection to the product and its value. When used rightly, novelty not only captures attention, but also imprints the message more firmly in memory. First impressions occupy a special place in sales interactions. When a buyer enters a store or encounters a salesman for the first time, the impression formed in the first moments often determines the outcome. Psychology teaches that impressions formed early are resistant to change, for the mind, having once taken a direction, tends to interpret subsequent facts in harmony with it. If the first impression is favorable, later hesitations are softened. If unfavorable, later arguments may be distrusted. Hence the importance of appearance, manner, and confidence in the seller. A pleasant greeting, a tone of assurance, an appearance of neatness, all contribute to a favorable impression. The first words spoken, the first gesture, the first look of the eye, may open the door of the buyer's confidence or close it. The process by which attention develops into interest is gradual. At first the mind is merely arrested, as by a bright color or a sudden sound. If the impression connects with something personal or significant, interest arises. Interest deepens when the object is associated with the buyer's desires, when imagination is stirred, when the mind perceives that satisfaction may be gained. Thus, the task of the advertiser is not merely to startle, but to lead the mind along this path from momentary attention to sustained interest. The task of the salesman is similar, to take the initial impression of friendliness or curiosity and deepen it into genuine concern for the article offered. The psychology of attention shows that the mind cannot attend equally to many things at once. Divided attention is weak attention. Therefore, the advertisement or the sales presentation must be simple, presenting one main idea clearly. A page crowded with many claims confuses the eye and disperses the mind. A salesman who talks of too many features at once fails to impress any. Concentration upon the one essential quality that most appeals to the buyer's motive is the secret of effectiveness. Once that impression is firmly fixed, other details may be added, but the first task is to strike one strong note. We must also note the influence of repetition in maintaining attention. An idea presented once may pass unnoticed, repeated several times in varied form, it begins to hold the mind. This principle justifies the constant recurrence of the same brand name, the same slogan, the same visual mark. Repetition does not merely enforce memory, it reinforces attention by creating familiarity. What is familiar requires less effort to perceive, and the mind therefore yields to it more easily. Yet repetition must be varied lest it lose freshness. The same idea must be clothed in new forms to combine the strength of novelty with the power of habit. Interest, once secured, transforms the entire process of selling. A buyer who is genuinely interested will ask questions, will consider advantages, will imagine the use of the product. His attention becomes active rather than passive. The role of the salesman is then to guide this interest toward decision. To awaken interest requires sympathy, imagination, and the ability to connect the product with the buyer's own needs and desires. It is not enough to recite features, one must interpret those features in terms of what they mean for the buyer. A machine is not merely efficient, it is a saver of time and labor. A garment is not merely durable, it is a source of pride in appearance. By translating features into benefits, the salesman nourishes interest. Curiosity and novelty also exert their influence in personal sales encounters. A question posed to the buyer that awakens reflection, a demonstration that reveals a hidden quality of the product, a comparison that is unexpected. All these kindle curiosity. The buyer becomes engaged, his mind drawn forward to discover more. Novelty in manner or in illustration prevents wariness and creates delight. The buyer who is surprised in a pleasant way is disposed to favor the product. Thus, the principles of attention in advertising and in sales are the same, though their application differs according to medium. First impressions in sales interactions extend beyond the initial greeting. The arrangement of the store, the display of goods, the demeanor of clerks, all contribute to the impression. A disorderly display suggests carelessness. A cluttered arrangement distracts attention. A gloomy atmosphere depresses interest. On the contrary, order, cleanliness, and brightness inspire confidence. Psychology teaches that these impressions, though perhaps unconscious, weigh heavily upon decision. The buyer may not analyze them, yet they color his entire experience. Therefore, the wise merchant attends to every detail that may contribute to a favorable first impression, knowing that the unseen influences are often the most decisive. The law of contrast is another principle of attention. An object is noticed more when it differs sharply from its background. This principle guides the choice of colors in advertising, the arrangement of goods in windows, the highlighting of key features in speech. A dark background with bright lettering, a quiet page with a bold word, a series of ordinary objects with one extraordinary, all make use of contrast. In personal sales, contrast may be shown by presenting the higher quality article beside the inferior, thus drawing attention to its superiority. Contrast awakens perception and guides choice. Emotion plays a role in sustaining interest. The mind dwells upon what excites feeling more than upon what is cold. Hence stories, examples, and images are powerful in salesmanship. An advertisement that tells a little tale, a salesman who relates how another customer found satisfaction, these means touch emotion and thereby hold interest. The cold recital of facts, however accurate, does not suffice. Facts must be made alive by connection with human experience. Thus, the psychology of attention merges with the psychology of emotion. In sum, the art of capturing attention and creating interest rests upon principles well established by psychology. Attention is gained through novelty, contrast, movement, and personal significance. Curiosity provides a bridge from mere notice to active engagement, while novelty renews the freshness of appeal. First impressions in sales interactions set the tone for the entire transaction, favoring success when they are pleasant and hindering it when they are not. Interest is deepened by connecting the product with the buyer's own desires, by using stories and examples that awaken emotion, and by translating features into personal benefits. Repetition fixes attention. Contrast guides it, and imagination sustains it. The seller who masters these principles commands the entrance to the buyer's mind and secures a place for his message amid the countless distractions of daily life. Persuasion is the living instrument of selling, for it is persuasion that transforms the mere presentation of goods into the act of purchase. The mind of the buyer is not compelled by force, but guided by influence. And influence works most surely when it harmonizes with the natural processes of thought and feeling. Language and suggestion, repetition and association, and the triggers that stir the hidden impulses of conduct are the means by which persuasion exerts its power. The student of psychology perceives in these means not tricks or artifices, but the application of laws that govern all mental life. The seller who understands these laws wields persuasion, not as a blunt instrument, but as a subtle and effective tool. Language is the first medium of persuasion. Through words, the seller interprets his goods to the buyer, giving form to the value that lies within them. Words not only convey facts, but awaken images, stir emotions, and suggest actions. The psychology of language shows that certain words carry strong associations, that the choice of one phrase over another may determine whether the listener is moved or indifferent. A word that evokes pleasure, pride, or security has more persuasive force than one that is coldly descriptive. The difference between "this machine is efficient" and "this machine will save you hours of labor" is the difference between abstract statement and personal benefit. In the first, the buyer hears a fact. In the second, he sees himself relieved of toil. Thus, language must be chosen not for its logical precision alone, but for its capacity to suggest personal meaning. Suggestion works because the mind is disposed to accept ideas that are confidently presented, especially when no contrary idea is present to oppose them. The seller who speaks with assurance implants his thought in the buyer's mind. When he places the article in the buyer's hand and remarks, "You will find this exactly suited to your need," the suggestion takes root before deliberate reasoning begins. Experiments in psychology have shown that the mind often acts upon suggested ideas without awareness of their origin. That behavior may follow from words spoken casually yet with conviction. This principle is seen in medicine, where the physician's confident prescription often produces improvement beyond the power of the drug itself. In sales, the same principle applies. The confidence of the salesman is transferred to the buyer, creating a predisposition toward acceptance. The art of suggestion requires tact, for direct command may arouse resistance while gentle indication passes unchallenged. A question such as "You will want the larger size. Will you not?" suggests the choice while leaving the appearance of freedom. The act of placing the product before the buyer rather than asking if he desires to see it suggests ownership. The emphasis upon satisfaction already enjoyed by others suggests conformity. All these forms of suggestion work because they insinuate rather than compel, guiding the buyer's thought without provoking defense. Repetition is another cornerstone of persuasion. The laws of psychology teach that associations are strengthened by recurrence, that ideas often presented acquire greater facility of recall and greater power to dominate conduct. The advertiser who repeats the same name, the same slogan, the same image across newspapers, billboards, and packages is building a mental pathway that the buyer will tread almost unconsciously. The first exposure may pass unnoticed, the second may be faintly remembered, but after many repetitions the idea becomes familiar and accepted. Familiarity breeds not contempt but comfort. The buyer tends to prefer what is known, for it requires less effort of attention and carries a sense of security. Thus, repetition is not wasted but accumulative. each impression reinforcing those that came before. Association multiplies the effect of repetition. When an article is linked with pleasant experiences, with admired persons, with respected institutions, its value is increased in the buyer's mind. The psychology of association rests upon the law that ideas occurring together tend to be recalled together. If the brand of a beverage is always shown in scenes of refreshment and sociability, the brand itself becomes associated with pleasure and companionship. If a soap is advertised beside images of purity and beauty, the soap inherits those qualities in imagination. Even the colors, the shapes, the sounds connected with a product can acquire associative power. A jingle repeated with the product's name links music with memory, making recall effortless. These associations may be entirely symbolic, yet their influence upon choice is undeniable. The power of repetition and association explains why advertisers invest vast sums in keeping their message before the public. They are not merely providing information, they are shaping habits of thought. Each repetition adds a thread to the fabric of association until the buyer's preference is formed less by reasoning than by the weight of accumulated impressions. The seller who fails to repeat and associate allows his rivals to occupy the field of memory. In Persuasion, absence is defeat, for the buyer cannot choose what he does not recall. Beyond language, suggestion, repetition, and association lie the deeper triggers of human conduct. These triggers are the fundamental motives that stir desire and move the will. Among them are the instincts of self-preservation, of acquisition, of imitation, of pride, and of social approval. The seller who appeals to these instincts touches the springs of action. When insurance is offered as protection against loss, the instinct of self-preservation is addressed. When a product is shown to confer advantage or profit, the instinct of acquisition responds. When testimonials display others who have chosen, the instinct of imitation is awakened. When luxury goods are presented as symbols of status, pride is aroused. When an article is recommended as the choice of the majority, the desire for social approval exerts its pull. These triggers are powerful because they are rooted in the very nature of man, and persuasion succeeds when it aligns with them. Another trigger is fear, which impels men to avoid danger or loss. Advertisements that remind the reader of risks, of disease without proper hygiene, of poverty without savings, of inconvenience without modern appliances, use fear to arouse action. Yet fear must be tempered with hope, for if the picture of danger is too overwhelming, it paralyzes rather than persuades. The skill lies in presenting the danger and immediately offering the product as the means of safety. In this way, fear is converted into a motive for purchase. Desire for pleasure is a corresponding trigger. Men are moved not only to avoid pain but to seek enjoyment. The depiction of delight, of comfort, of beauty awakens this motive. A picture of a happy family at table, of a traveler at ease in luxurious surroundings, of a child playing joyfully, all serve to link the product with the pursuit of happiness. Here again, association strengthens the appeal. The product becomes not merely an object, but a symbol of pleasure. Scarcity is another psychological trigger, for what is rare or limited is esteemed more highly. When the seller suggests that only a few articles remain, or that the opportunity will soon vanish, the buyer's desire is sharpened. Psychology shows that men regret more keenly what they have missed than what they have rejected, and the suggestion of scarcity awakens the fear of regret. This principle explains the power of limited time offers, of exclusive editions, of special bargains. They press upon the mind the urgency of decision, breaking through hesitation. Authority exerts similar influence. Men are disposed to trust the judgment of those they regard as knowledgeable or powerful. The endorsement of experts, the approval of institutions, the association with leaders, all lend authority to a product. The psychology of obedience and respect for status assures that such authority persuades even when the buyer himself has little evidence. This explains why advertisements cite physicians, engineers, or public figures, and why salesmen emphasize their own experience and reliability. Authority is a trigger that substitutes trust for personal investigation. Finally, consistency acts as a trigger, for men desire to appear consistent in their choices. If a buyer has once shown interest, he is more likely to purchase, for refusal would seem a reversal. The skilled salesman, therefore, secures small commitments first: an agreement to examine the product, to accept a demonstration, to compare prices. Each small step paves the way for the larger, as the mind seeks to remain consistent with its own prior actions. This principle of progressive commitment is as true in sales as in personal life, where habits once begun are hard to break. Thus, persuasion is not a matter of accident, but of applying the laws of psychology. Language, when chosen with care, conveys not only facts but feelings. Suggestion, delivered with confidence, implants ideas that guide action. Repetition builds familiarity, association enriches meaning, and the great triggers of human conduct, fear, pleasure, pride, imitation, authority, scarcity, and consistency, stir the impulses that lead to decision. The seller who knows these forces wields influence with certainty. He does not compel, he guides. He does not deceive, he interprets the product in harmony with the buyer's own nature. In this lies the true art of persuasion, the art by which selling and advertising rise from mere trade to the application of science to human affairs. Memory is the storehouse of experience, and without it neither selling nor advertising would have lasting effect. The buyer confronted with 1,000 impressions in the course of a day cannot act upon all of them at once. He must retain some and forget others, carrying in his mind those that guide his future choices. The science of psychology has long studied the conditions of retention and forgetting, and its lessons are of the highest value to the seller. For if an advertisement or a sales appeal is forgotten, it is as though it had never been made. But if it is remembered, it continues to exert its influence long after the voice has ceased or the page has been turned. The art of selling, therefore, must be in large measure the art of planting impressions so firmly that they persist and recur when the moment of decision arrives. The first fact we must recognize is that memory is selective. Men do not remember all they encounter, but only a fraction, and the fraction is determined by the vividness, the emotional tone, and the repetition of the impression. A faint or colorless message disappears quickly, while one that excites interest or emotion is more firmly fixed. This truth explains why advertisements seek to arouse feeling, why salesmen strive to make their words concrete and personal. The mind retains what stirs it, it forgets what leaves it cold. Experiments have shown that nonsense syllables repeated many times can be remembered, but meaningful words are remembered far more easily because they connect with ideas already established in the mind. The advertiser who appeals to familiar experiences, who uses words that awaken images of daily life, is therefore working with the natural tendencies of memory. Repetition is the great ally of memory. Each recurrence of an idea strengthens the association, making recall more rapid and more certain. A buyer who has seen a brand name 100 times cannot avoid its recall when he stands at the counter. The principle of frequency is so powerful that even trivial matters, if often repeated, may dominate the mind. Yet repetition must be wisely managed, for monotonous repetition may dull attention, and impressions made without interest are less firmly retained. Variation in form combined with constancy of idea is the secret. A slogan repeated in different contexts, an image shown in new settings, a phrase echoed in speech and print, these reinforce memory without exhausting attention. The science of forgetting reveals another aspect. Impressions fade over time unless renewed. The curve of forgetting, studied in psychological laboratories, shows that loss is greatest soon after learning, then diminishes. This means that advertisements and sales appeals must be renewed frequently in the early stages if they are to be retained. A single exposure may produce a fleeting impression, but without reinforcement it vanishes. Multiple exposures, spaced over time, establish a more enduring trace. This is why campaigns must persist and why sellers must follow up initial contacts. To plant an impression and then abandon it is to allow forgetting to destroy one's labor. Emotion assists retention. Events accompanied by strong feeling are remembered long after indifferent experiences are gone. The buyer remembers the advertisement that amused him, that startled him, that appealed to his pride or his sympathy. He recalls the salesman who told a story that touched his imagination. Emotion gives color to memory, making it vivid and lasting. Therefore, the wise advertiser seeks not only to inform but to stir, knowing that what is charged with feeling is most likely to be recalled. Association also aids memory. When a new impression is linked with many others already in the mind, it has more avenues of recall. A brand connected with health, beauty, and social approval may be recalled whenever any of these ideas arise. The richer the network of associations, the stronger the hold upon memory. This explains why advertisements often present goods in varied contexts, connecting them with different aspects of life, so that many doors lead back to the same idea. The product becomes entwined with daily experience, reappearing whenever familiar thoughts recur. Simplicity strengthens retention. The mind remembers one strong idea more readily than many scattered details. A single striking slogan, a single image, a single promise is more effective than a multitude. The law of memory favors unity, for confusion is the enemy of recall. The buyer who has heard a jumble of claims may forget them all, while one clear phrase remains. The history of advertising is rich with examples of simple messages that endured for decades, while complex appeals faded quickly. The principle holds equally in personal sales. One decisive advantage clearly expressed is remembered when minor details are forgotten. First impressions are also powerful in memory. What comes first in a presentation often leaves a lasting trace, for the mind gives special weight to beginnings. Likewise, what comes last is also well remembered, for it is fresh. This primacy and recency effect is confirmed by experiment. The advertiser should therefore place his most important idea at the start or at the close, ensuring its retention. The salesman should begin with a point that fixes attention and end with one that lingers in the buyer's mind. In between he may present other details, but it is the opening and the conclusion that endure. Imagery enriches memory. Words that call up pictures, metaphors that stir imagination, concrete descriptions that appeal to the senses, all produce impressions more easily retained. A bare statement such as "our soap is pure" may be forgotten, but an image of a spotless garment, a child's fresh skin, a crystal stream, these remain. The advertiser who paints pictures in the mind is writing upon the tablets of memory. The salesman who tells a vivid story of a customer's satisfaction makes his point unforgettable. Memory is nourished by imagination, for the mind recalls images more easily than abstractions. The design of messages that stick must therefore attend to all these principles. The message must be simple, vivid, emotional, and repeated. It must connect with familiar associations and appeal to personal experience. It must be placed where it will be encountered often, reinforced at intervals that prevent forgetting. It must be clothed in language that suggests images, supported by stories that awaken feeling. Its first impression must be favorable, its conclusion strong. When all these conditions are fulfilled, the message becomes part of the buyer's mental equipment, ready to reappear whenever the opportunity for purchase arises. One must also consider the role of habit in memory. The act of recalling a product and choosing it becomes easier with practice, until it is nearly automatic. Each time the buyer repeats the purchase, the association between the need and the brand grows stronger. Eventually, the brand is remembered not by deliberate recall, but by the very act of encountering the need. Toothpaste is linked with the habit of brushing, coffee with the morning meal, tobacco with relaxation. The advertisement that establishes such habits ensures memory through conduct itself, for the action calls up the idea without conscious effort. Yet memory is not infallible, and forgetting can be turned to advantage by rivals. If a brand lapses from view, competitors may occupy its place in the mind. This is why vigilance is necessary, why the successful product must remain before the public. Out of sight is soon out of mind, and out of mind is out of market. The psychology of forgetting is as stern as the psychology of retention, reminding us that neglect is fatal. The battle for memory is continuous, for the buyer's mind is a field in which impressions contend, some fading, others enduring, each seeking to dominate recall at the critical moment of choice. The science of retention also emphasizes the importance of personal relevance. Impressions connected with one's own life are remembered more than those that are merely general. The advertisement that speaks directly to the reader, that seems to address his needs and circumstances, is more firmly retained. Personalization, whether in language, imagery, or direct address, engraves the message upon memory. The salesman who adapts his words to the particular concerns of the buyer secures the same effect. To be remembered, the message must be made personal. Another principle is that of distinctiveness. What stands out is remembered, what blends with the ordinary is forgotten. An unusual word, a striking design, a surprising statement, all make impressions more lasting. Distinctiveness is a form of novelty, but its effect persists in memory long after attention has passed. A single unusual feature may cause the entire message to be recalled. This is why unique slogans, peculiar packages, and singular trademarks are valuable. They make the brand distinct, and distinctness assures memory. In conclusion, the psychology of memory teaches us that advertising and salesmanship succeed only when they plant impressions that endure. To be effective, these impressions must be vivid, repeated, emotional, associated, simple, distinctive, and personal. They must be reinforced before they are forgotten, renewed at intervals, and connected with habits of conduct. When such conditions are met, the advertisement or the sales pitch becomes not a passing distraction, but a permanent influence. The buyer recalls it at the moment of choice, and recall becomes purchase. The seller who masters these principles commands not only attention in the present, but preference in the future. Memory thus becomes the invisible ally of persuasion, carrying the voice of the advertisement across days and weeks until it speaks again within the mind of the buyer. Emotions are the deep currents of the mind that move men with a force greater than logic. They shape desire, they color judgment, and they guide conduct in ways that are often hidden from awareness. In selling and advertising, emotion is not a mere ornament, but the very substance of persuasion. A product becomes truly powerful in the marketplace when it is linked with the aspirations, fears, and satisfactions of the buyer. To understand this is to see why goods of little practical necessity may command vast demand, and why others of plain utility must nevertheless clothe themselves in emotional appeal to secure attention. The psychology of desire is at once the psychology of human life itself, for every purchase is an expression of yearning, of pride, of comfort sought, or of status affirmed. The linking of products to aspirations enlarges their significance beyond material use. A garment is not purchased only to cover the body, but to express beauty, respectability, or distinction. An automobile is not chosen solely for transportation, but for the sense of freedom, progress, and achievement it embodies. A book may be bought not only for its words, but for the image of refinement it confers upon its owner. In each case, the product becomes a symbol of something greater, of some inner aspiration. Advertising accomplishes this link by showing the buyer not merely the article, but the life that surrounds it, the higher state of being that accompanies its possession. The housewife is shown not simply soap, but the happiness of a spotless home. The young man is shown not merely a razor, but the confidence of smooth appearance before his peers. In this way, aspiration is joined with the object, and the purchase becomes the means to an end that lies in the heart. Fear is among the most compelling of emotions in commerce, for men are moved to act lest they suffer loss or danger. Insurance appeals to fear of poverty, medicine to fear of disease, safety devices to fear of accident. Yet the art of using fear in advertising lies not in overwhelming the buyer with terror, but in presenting danger alongside the means of escape. An advertisement that paints only gloom paralyzes, one that shows the risk and immediately offers the product as protection moves to action. The psychology of fear is double-edged. It arouses attention, but must be swiftly balanced with hope. The salesman who reminds the buyer of possible regret for failing to secure a bargain is using fear in mild form, stirring uneasiness that can be relieved only by purchase. Thus fear, when guided with skill, becomes a strong motive for decision. Pride is another powerful driver. Men take satisfaction in their appearance, their possessions, their achievements, and they desire recognition from others. Goods that flatter pride by promising distinction, admiration, or superiority find eager acceptance. The costly watch, the fine clothing, the luxurious motor car all appeal to pride. They proclaim success and elicit the regard of others. Advertisers recognize this when they depict products in settings of elegance, when they suggest that only the discerning few appreciate their quality, when they connect ownership with accomplishment. Pride assures the buyer that by choosing the article, he demonstrates his worth. It is not the utility of the object alone that persuades, but the enhancement of the self. Status, closely related to pride, exerts its influence through the desire to belong to a higher circle, to partake of what is esteemed. Fashion is governed by this motive. Individuals buy what is in vogue not because it is objectively superior, but because it confers membership in a desired group. The young man who wears a certain style of shoe does so because his fellows wear it. The family that owns a particular brand of automobile may do so to signal its standing in the community. Advertising cultivates status by associating products with admired figures, with social elites, with the symbols of prosperity. When a brand is presented as the choice of leaders, it becomes a ladder by which others hope to climb. The psychology of status ensures that such appeals find ready response, for men fear exclusion and seek esteem. Comfort is another deep motive, arising from the desire to avoid strain and to enjoy ease. Articles that promise relief, rest, or convenience touch this motive. The easy chair, the labor-saving device, the nourishing food, all appeal to comfort. Advertising heightens this by depicting weary men refreshed, busy housewives spared toil, children at peace. Comfort is often less dramatic than fear or pride, yet it is pervasive, for the quest of life is to find ease amid effort. The seller who links his product to comfort taps a universal desire. Even luxury goods often conceal their appeal to comfort under the guise of elegance, promising not only distinction but relaxation and indulgence. Case studies of emotional advertising illustrate these principles. Consider the campaign of a soap that emphasized purity and beauty. Instead of describing chemical composition, the advertisements showed images of spotless children, of radiant women, of white garments. The emotional appeal was to the aspiration of every mother for her child's cleanliness, to the pride of every woman in her appearance. The soap became not merely a cleanser, but a symbol of purity and refinement. Sales increased not because of rational analysis, but because of the emotional bond created. Another case is the sale of life insurance. Advertisers long ago discovered that figures of mortality tables and rational arguments were insufficient. Instead, they painted pictures of widows and children left destitute, of families protected and secure. They appealed to fear of loss and to love of family. The buyer, stirred by these emotions, saw in the policy not a cold contract, but a safeguard of affection. Here fear and love combined to create an irresistible motive. A striking example is found in the promotion of automobiles. Early advertising did not dwell upon horsepower or mechanics, but upon the freedom of the open road, the pride of modern progress, the status of ownership. Pictures of happy families traveling in comfort, of young couples enjoying adventure, of dignified men at the wheel, conveyed aspiration more than utility. The automobile became not just a machine, but a gateway to a new life. Desire was awakened not by engineering, but by the emotional vision of what the automobile symbolized. We may also note campaigns for war bonds during times of conflict. These did not argue interest rates or financial returns, but appealed to patriotism, duty, and the fear of defeat. Posters showed soldiers in peril, children looking to their fathers, flags waving. The emotional appeal was direct and powerful, moving citizens to sacrifice willingly. Here the product was intangible, yet the emotions aroused were among the deepest of human life. Such cases reveal that emotional advertising does not depend upon deceit, but upon understanding the motives that actually govern conduct. Buyers rarely act upon cold reason alone. Their decisions are colored by fear of loss, by pride in self, by longing for status, by desire for comfort, and by countless other emotions. To speak to these emotions is to speak to the truth of human nature. The seller who denies them is ineffective. The seller who masters them is persuasive. The psychology of satisfaction completes the cycle of desire. Once the product is obtained, the emotion shifts from anticipation to possession. If the article fulfills the promise, satisfaction reinforces the choice, establishing loyalty. If it disappoints, dissatisfaction breeds resentment, and future persuasion is weakened. Thus, emotional appeal must be supported by genuine value. The buyer who feels pride confirmed, comfort realized, fear relieved, or aspiration fulfilled becomes a permanent customer. Memory of satisfaction strengthens desire for repetition, and habit is formed. In this way, emotions not only initiate purchase, but sustain it. The role of imagination must also be acknowledged. Emotions are stirred most deeply when the buyer imagines himself in the scene depicted. He sees his family safe, his neighbors admiring, his body at ease, his ambitions fulfilled. Advertising provides the images, but the buyer completes them with his own imagination. The more vividly he sees himself in possession, the stronger the desire. This is why demonstrations, testimonials, and pictorial illustrations are powerful. They aid the imagination in turning possibility into vision. In every age of commerce, we find that the most successful appeals are those that clothe products in the garments of emotion. From the markets of antiquity, where sellers praised goods with stories and flattery, to the modern billboards and magazines, the principle is unchanged. Men buy not only with the mind, but with the heart. To link goods with the deep motives of human life is to make them irresistible. Psychology provides the explanation, but practice has long confirmed it. Emotions are not obstacles to reason, but companions of it, guiding choice in harmony with the whole nature of man. Thus, the study of emotions, desire, and satisfaction reveals the true power of advertising. It teaches that products must be linked to aspirations, that fear, pride, status, and comfort are the pillars of persuasion, and that satisfaction alone converts desire into loyalty. It shows by countless examples that the heart must be engaged before the hand will act. And it confirms that the true art of selling lies not in argument alone, but in the wise appeal to the enduring passions of mankind. The application of psychology in selling is not a matter of abstract theory, but of daily practice. The seller who understands the laws of the mind must translate them into methods that win confidence, awaken desire, and lead to decision. The science of psychology becomes useful only when it shapes conduct in the actual encounter between buyer and seller. The sales process may therefore be viewed as a sequence of psychological stages, from the first impression through the growth of interest and desire to the final act of purchase. At each stage, certain principles guide success, and these principles are the fruit of psychological study. The beginning of every sale is the approach. The first words, the first look, the first manner of address set the tone. Psychology has shown the power of first impressions, how they color all subsequent judgment. A friendly and confident manner, an appearance of neatness, a tone that conveys respect, all these predispose the buyer to listen. The mind is most open when it is favorably inclined, and therefore the wise salesman attends with care to the preliminaries. He does not begin with a flood of information, but with a courteous greeting that invites attention. At this early moment, suggestion is more potent than argument. The buyer is guided by his impression of the man before he considers the merits of the goods. Once attention is secured, the seller must apply his knowledge of motives to awaken interest. He must discern what impulse is most active in the buyer, whether pride, comfort, economy, or curiosity. To speak indiscriminately is to waste effort. To strike the chord that resonates with the buyer's disposition is to move him quickly. Psychology teaches that men differ in their dominant motives. The mother may be most stirred by affection for her children, the businessman by desire for efficiency, the youth by longing for status. The seller must therefore observe keenly, ask questions, and listen, so that he may adapt his presentation to the motive present. This adaptation is not deception but interpretation, for the product may have many values, and the wise salesman emphasizes that which meets the buyer's immediate desire. Language in this stage must be concrete and personal. Facts stated in general terms do not impress as much as facts applied to the buyer himself. Instead of saying, "This machine saves time," the salesman may say, "This will shorten your daily labor by an hour." The buyer must see himself in possession, his own life made easier or more satisfying. Psychology here teaches the value of imagery and imagination. When the buyer imagines himself enjoying the benefit, desire is already half formed. The seller supplies the suggestion, the buyer's mind completes it. As interest deepens, the seller must build trust and credibility. Without trust, persuasion fails, for the buyer resists the influence of one he does not believe. Psychology explains that trust rests upon confidence in character and competence. The salesman must therefore appear honest, straightforward, and knowledgeable. Hesitation, evasion, or exaggeration arouse suspicion. Confidence, clarity, and fairness inspire belief. Testimonials, guarantees, and demonstrations all serve to strengthen credibility, for they supply external confirmation. The buyer who sees proof with his own eyes, who hears the testimony of others, who is assured of protection against loss, is reassured. Credibility is the soil in which desire can grow into decision. Trust is also built by sympathy. When the buyer feels that the salesman understands his needs, shares his concerns, and respects his intelligence, resistance is softened. The psychology of social relations teaches that men are influenced by those they like and with whom they feel kinship. The salesman who listens patiently, who responds with genuine interest, who avoids arrogance, wins goodwill. This goodwill acts as a lubricant in the transaction, making persuasion smooth. The buyer does not feel coerced but assisted. Thus, trust is not only a matter of facts but of personal relation. When objections arise, as they inevitably do, the seller must handle them with psychological insight. Objections are not always expressions of real difficulty. Often they are signs of hesitation, of uncertainty, of resistance born of caution. To meet them with contradiction is to arouse defense, To meet them with patience is to disarm. The psychology of resistance shows that direct opposition strengthens the will to oppose, while agreement on some point reduces hostility. The wise salesman therefore acknowledges the reasonableness of the buyer's concern before offering explanation. He may say, "Many feel as you do, but they have found, and then present evidence." In this way he joins rather than fights, and the buyer is more ready to yield. Some objections are rational, concerning price, durability, or quality. These require facts and demonstrations. Others are emotional, springing from fear, habit, or prejudice. These require sympathy and suggestion. The seller must diagnose the type of objection and apply the suitable response. If the objection is price, he may emphasize long-term saving. If it is habit, he may suggest trial without obligation. If it is fear, he may show guarantee. Each objection is an opportunity to deepen persuasion if met wisely. Psychology thus serves as a guide in transforming resistance into agreement. The closing of the sale is the culmination of the process, and here again psychology provides rules. The buyer who has shown interest and considered advantages is at a point of decision, yet hesitation may linger. To prolong discussion often weakens desire. The salesman must therefore suggest action at the proper moment. This may be done by assuming the sale, by asking which model the buyer prefers, by placing the article ready for purchase. The principle of suggestion, so potent at the beginning, is potent again at the end. The buyer is led gently rather than pushed. Once action is taken, satisfaction follows, and the transaction is complete. The practical application of psychology in selling is also evident in follow-up. The satisfied buyer, reinforced by memory of his good experience, becomes a source of future business. Psychology shows that satisfaction strengthens habit and that repeated actions become automatic. By ensuring that the buyer feels rewarded, the seller plants the seed of loyalty. Letters of appreciation, continued service, reminders, all help to preserve the impression. Thus the sale is not an isolated act but part of a relationship. We may illustrate these principles by examples. A salesman presenting a labor-saving device may first greet the farmer with respect, gaining attention. Observing his wariness, he emphasizes the motive of comfort and efficiency. He demonstrates the machine, letting the farmer imagine his own work shortened. He builds trust by showing testimonials from neighbors and by offering a guarantee. When the farmer objects to cost, he acknowledges the concern and points out the saving of labor over years. At the close, he suggests, "Shall I deliver it tomorrow or next week?" The farmer, guided by suggestion and relieved of objection, decides. Every stage illustrates the application of psychology. Another example may be drawn from the sale of clothing. The salesman notes the pride of the customer in appearance. He directs attention to garments that flatter, uses language that awakens imagination of admiration from others, and builds trust by showing fine workmanship. When the buyer hesitates, fearing extravagance, the salesman sympathizes, then points out the durability and the impression upon associates. He closes by suggesting a fitting. Again, psychology guides the process. The handling of resistance is illustrated by the sale of books. A prospective buyer objects that he has no time to read. The salesman acknowledges the difficulty, then suggests that even a few minutes each day will bring pleasure. He tells of others who found new enjoyment in brief intervals. By joining the objection and turning it, he overcomes it. Thus objection becomes a path to persuasion. In every case the principles are the same. Secure favorable impression, adapt to motive, use language of imagery and suggestion, build trust through honesty and proof, handle objections with patience and sympathy, and close with timely suggestion. The seller who practices these is applying psychology in its most practical form. It must be remembered that persuasion, without sincerity, is short-lived. The buyer may be induced once, but if the product fails to satisfy, trust is destroyed. Psychology therefore insists upon the harmony of appeal and reality. The true art of selling is not to mislead, but to interpret genuine values in a manner suited to the mind. When the product is worthy, psychology provides the means to present it effectively. When it is unworthy, no art can sustain long success. Thus, psychology, rightly used, is the servant of both commerce and integrity. The building of trust and credibility, the handling of objections, the wise application of motives. All these show that selling is not mere pressure, but a discipline grounded in knowledge of human nature. The salesman becomes not a peddler, but a student of conduct, a guide of decision, an interpreter of value. His skill lies not in forcing the buyer's hand, but in aligning the product with the natural currents of the buyer's mind. By doing so, he ensures satisfaction, and satisfaction, once gained, multiplies itself in loyalty and recommendation. The psychology of selling thus finds its highest expression in practical application, where theory and life meet in the daily commerce of men. The study of selling and advertising as shaped by psychology brings us at last to reflection. We have considered the processes of attention, memory, persuasion, desire, and satisfaction, and we have observed their application in practice. Yet knowledge of human nature imposes not only opportunity, but responsibility. The very power that psychology lends to the seller may be misused, if not guided by ethical regard. Persuasion, when turned solely to selfish ends, becomes manipulation. The true art of selling must therefore balance the pursuit of profit with the welfare of the buyer. For commerce rests not upon single exchanges, but upon the enduring relationship between those who offer and those who receive. The ethical considerations in persuasion arise from the fact that the seller holds influence over the buyer's choices. To awaken desires, to arouse fears, to guide imagination is to touch the springs of action. If these influences are exercised without regard to truth, the buyer may be led to disappointment, and disappointment breeds distrust. The psychology of satisfaction teaches us that deception may win a sale but will not retain a customer. A product that fails to fulfill the promise made by advertising not only loses future business, but injures the standing of all commerce. Honesty is therefore not merely a moral duty, but a commercial necessity. To persuade sincerely, to emphasize real virtues, to avoid claims that cannot be supported, this is the path of enduring success. The ethical use of psychology also recognizes the dignity of the buyer. He is not a passive creature to be compelled, but a rational and emotional being whose needs and desires deserve respect. To exploit weakness, to prey upon ignorance, to create artificial wants without value, is to degrade both seller and buyer. Psychology properly applied seeks not to coerce but to harmonize, to show the buyer how a product truly serves his welfare. This conception transforms selling from trickery to service, from exploitation to cooperation. The seller becomes an advisor, a guide who interprets goods in terms of the buyer's life. Such persuasion strengthens rather than diminishes the autonomy of the buyer, for it clarifies choice and helps him to secure genuine satisfaction. Long-term customer relationships are founded upon this ethical base. Psychology shows that satisfaction breeds habit, and habit builds loyalty. A single purchase won by exaggeration may enrich today, but repeated purchases won by trust enrich tomorrow and all the days after. The seller who regards each transaction as the beginning of a relationship understands the true nature of commerce. He seeks not only to close the sale, but to open the way for future business. Every contact leaves an impression, and that impression determines whether the buyer will return. Trust, respect, and fairness accumulate like capital in the bank of reputation. The most successful merchants are those whose customers return again and again, not because they were persuaded once, but because they were satisfied always. The cultivation of long-term relationships requires attention beyond the moment of sale. Follow-up letters, continued service, the the honoring of guarantees, all sustain the impression of reliability. Psychology reminds us that memory fades unless renewed, so too goodwill must be refreshed by continued contact. A customer who hears nothing after the sale may drift to other sources. One who is remembered feels valued and remains. The emotional bond between buyer and seller grows with each renewal, transforming commerce into community. In this way, the application of psychology extends beyond immediate persuasion to the maintenance of lasting ties. Looking to the future of psychology in sales and advertising, we must recognize that the science itself is still young. The experimental study of attention, memory, habit, and emotion has only begun to reveal the laws that govern human behavior. Each decade brings new discoveries that refine our understanding. As laboratories perfect methods of measurement, as statistics reveal patterns of conduct, as observation of groups and masses becomes more exact, the applications to commerce will multiply. The future promises more than crude appeals to desire. It promises scientific adjustment of selling methods to the real nature of human choice. The advertising of tomorrow will be tested by experiment before it is broadcast. The arrangement of shops will be guided by knowledge of perception. The training of salesmen will rest upon verified principles. Thus, psychology will continue to transform commerce into a more exact art. Yet the future also demands vigilance, for greater power brings greater responsibility. As we learn to influence more surely, the temptation to misuse that influence grows. The science that can awaken desire can also create unnecessary wants. The knowledge that can strengthen loyalty can also foster dependence. The ethical foundation must therefore remain firm. The true future of psychology in commerce lies not in exploitation, but in service, in guiding industry to meet genuine needs with greater efficiency and to bring greater satisfaction to life. If the science is wedded to honesty, it will elevate business. If divorced from ethics, it will debase it. We may anticipate that new media of communication will extend the reach of advertising. Already the printed page, the poster, and the spoken word have multiplied impressions. In the future, new instruments may carry messages to greater audiences with swifter force. Psychology will be called upon to adapt its principles to these media, to determine how attention is gained in new circumstances, how memory is aided, how emotion is stirred. The essentials will remain unchanged, for human nature does not alter, but the forms of application will expand. The wise merchant of the future will rely not upon guesswork, but upon tested knowledge, not upon tradition, but upon science. The reflections upon the study of selling and advertising thus lead us back to the central truth. Commerce is an exchange of human values, and psychology is the study of the mind that governs those values. The seller who understands attention, interest, desire, memory, and satisfaction possesses tools of immense power. But he must wield them with integrity, building trust, creating loyalty, and serving genuine needs. In so doing, he not only prospers himself, but contributes to the stability and honor of trade. The science of psychology, applied with wisdom, will continue to enrich commerce, not by trickery but by truth, not by exploiting the buyer, but by helping him to secure what he most desires. In closing, we recognize that the psychology of selling and advertising is not a finished system, but a field of growth. Its future will be shaped by the continued study of the mind, by the ethical resolve of merchants, and by the practical demands of industry. But its direction is clear. From intuition to science, from guesswork to principle, from manipulation to service, the path has already been traced. The reflections of today become the foundation of tomorrow. The seller who joins knowledge with honesty, who builds relationships upon trust, who applies psychology not merely to win but to satisfy, stands as the true representative of modern commerce. In him the science of mind and the art of trade are united, and in that union lies the future of selling and advertising.